Okay, so this was a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do after that? What did that lead to?
Yes, I every intent to head back to Australia. In fact, if I can recall correctly, I think I was in advanced conversations with Brian Fisher about picking up a job at the University of Sydney as a lecturer. And as I was finishing off my PhD, I got a call from a guy who I had no clue who he was. His name is Bill Gamble, who was the Director General of the International Service for National Agricultural Research, a CGIAR centre based in The Hague. And he was swinging through through Minnesota, and he took me out to lunch and said, we'd like you to come and do a consultancy for us to start thinking about developing elements of a research program at ISNAR. ISNAR, it was the International Service for National Agricultural Research, so it had a very strong mission to sort of help improve the institutional structure and the management and operational performances of agricultural research centres around the world. But Bill was smart enough to know that they needed to do more than service. They needed to actually research what they were doing and provide evidence to support the efforts that they were doing. So I went to The Hague on what was meant to be a 4-month consultancy, which ended up being a 20-year career in the CG. But while I was at The Hague, I actually conceived of and launched what's now become the ASTI initiative, the Agricultural Science and Technology Indicators Initiative. So for one who's interested in looking at investments in the consequences of R&D spending, it turned out there were very scanty data back in the day to actually understand what the levels of investment were in agricultural R&D. So we, as I say, spent the time conceiving of this project. The head of this embryonic shop at ISNAR then was a colleague, Eduardo Trigo from Argentina, and when I look back, he basically gave me huge degrees of freedom to run with an idea, and it struck a chord. So Bill Gamble, the boss at the time, really wanted to push this forward, and all we'd done is sort of lay out the conceptual ideas about how you might proceed on doing that. So I was fortunate enough to not only be then running this project on measuring productivity growth in US agriculture, but flipping back and forth to The Hague and starting to build up a team that started doing original survey work around the world. We engaged the Science and Technology shop at the OECD in Paris and went down to Paris multiple times to visit with those folks about sort of data capture methodologies and so forth. And so proud to say that we birthed that project, and I mentored that through nearly 20 years, and it grew to be an ongoing program that's now basically the go-to place for R&D spending estimates worldwide.
It also seems to me that could have been the start of your focus on collecting significant data sets and using large data sets.
Yeah, I think both the RFF productivity work, which is still ongoing, and the centre I founded when I came here to Minnesota, INSTEP, the International Science and Technology Practice and Policy Centre, cute acronym, lousy name, but basically what it was an incarnation of building off this legacy of this long history of Vern Rattan and Ed Shue and Willis Peterson and Bert Sundquist and a host of others who had basically, Minnesota had, along with Chicago and North Carolina State, had given birth to the economics of R&D, if you will. And in all regards, there was just a dearth of data wherever you looked, and sort of productivity measures on R&D investment data and things like that. So yeah, I think I have had a lifelong passion for trying to both put novel data sets together and make sense of that data. And I think particularly with the training I got at IFPRI, I happened to be there at sort of, I think, a really sweet spot for IFPRI. The DG at the time was a World Food Prize laureate, Per Pinstrup Anderson, who had also himself had done some pretty pivotal work back in the day on aspects related to investments in R&D and nutrition consequences of that R&D. So he recruited me in there to lead the science and technology work at IFPRI.
So how did you get from ISNAR to IFPRI?
That's an interesting story. So we, I'd been at ISNAR for some time, and I'd heard of Per, never met him, and likewise he'd read my stuff but had never met me. And he reached out to me, and we initially started negotiating about a joint venture between ISNAR and IFPRI on looking at the returns to R&D and R&D investments and R&D policy issues and so forth. And for one reason or another, that didn't come to pass. Whilst we were trying to build up this research focus in ISNAR, there was some tension within the organisation that we were sort of pushing too far down a research track and losing focus on the sort of service track. And so Per had sensed that himself, I think, and was working to try and sort of bridge the gap between IFPRI and ISNAR. And as I say, it didn't work out. So I was getting pushback from some senior management in ISNAR to do this work, and so I actually opted to leave without actually having a job. We had a fantastic team. So I had assembled a group of people, which included Schengen Fan, who's now the Director General of IFPRI, and Ruben Echeverria, who's now the Director General of CGIAR, were part of my research team. So it was a pretty quality group of people. But as I say, there was sort of tension between the push we were doing on this research front and the remit of the centre. And so I was, in a sense, resigned on principle because I believed and had a passion about what we were doing. And look back with some angst because I had luckily a supportive wife but 2 young kids, and the Aussie network did its trick. I think within a few days I got a call from Derek Biley, who at that time was working at the World Bank, and offered me a consultancy job for the World Bank, which I accepted. And about a week later, Per Pinstrup Anderson called up with an ironic twist in his voice and said, "I hear you might be looking for a job. Would you like to come and lead the science and technology policy program at IFPRI?"
So that made a move to Washington.
So that made the move to Washington happen, yeah. So,
how long were you in Washington?
I was in Washington, what was it, 8, nearly 9 years. And IFPRI had done some earlier work. There was a guy called Peter Oram, who was an FAO guy. And Peter had actually done some of the very early work on investments in R&D globally, and which we'd sort of picked up but then more formalised at ISNAR. But Per wanted to sort of do a lot more work along the lines of research evaluation, but also thinking more strategically about the incentives and policy structures confronting food and ag R&D worldwide, and so asked me to sort of come in and help build that up. And I worked in a division called the Environment and Production Technology Division, which at that time was led by Peter Hazel, who had also done quite a bit of work in the sort of technology area, including a lot of work in the early days with Jock Anderson, and looking at issues related to riskiness in agriculture. But Peter was head of the division that I and the group that I work with in there, and I ran across lots of areas members. When I was at ISNAR, another famous Australian was chair of the board of ISNAR, Mr. John Dillon. And I remember when my first child was born, John insisted coming to the hospital. And I can, those of you who knew John had really big sort of meat-fisty hands, and I can remember him holding my son up in his hands and my son nearly disappearing in John's fist. But yeah, John, he was very supportive of what we were trying to do at ISNAR at that time and building up this capacity. And when I went to IFPRI, it was great having Jeff around too, and he was very supportive of this work as well. So Airie's reach around the CG is pretty remarkable. I mean, my paths continually crossed with the likes of Derek Biley when he was down at CIMMIT and then went to the World Bank, and Jock. So when I was in DC, Jock was in the World Bank, Derek was around at the World Bank, and so there was a few blocks away, there was lots of cross-fertilisation going on between all of those institutions, and an Aussie network helping make that happen.